They called him the most dangerous man in America. Not because he carried a gun, not because he commanded armies, but because he owned the rails. And in the 1860s, if you controlled the rails, you controlled everything. Food prices, mail delivery, whether a town lived or died. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't just build a transportation empire. He built a chokehold. His competitors feared him. Politicians courted him. The public despised him. And none of it mattered, because by the time anyone realized how much power he'd accumulated, it was already too late to stop him. This is the story of how one man turned iron and steam into absolute dominance, and what happened when America finally tried to break free. Cornelius Vanderbilt was 70 years old when he decided to conquer the railroads. Most men at that age were planning their retirement. Vanderbilt was planning his second empire. He'd already made his fortune in steamships, cutthroat competition on the Hudson River, and transatlantic routes that had earned him the nickname Commodore. He'd undercut rivals until they bled money, then bought their companies for pennies. He'd bribed officials, threatened competitors, and once deliberately crashed the stock of a company just to prove he could. But steamships had a problem. They were limited by water. Rivers froze. Oceans had storms. And increasingly, the American economy was moving inland, toward the vast prairies and mountain ranges where ships couldn't follow. Railroads, though. Railroads went everywhere. In 1862, Vanderbilt began quietly buying shares in the New York and Harlem Railroad, a small, struggling line that most investors considered worthless. Within a year, he controlled it. Within 2, he'd seized the Hudson River Railroad, then the New York Central. Each acquisition gave him more leverage over the next. His method was surgical. He'd identify a struggling railroad, drive down its stock price through manipulation and whispered rumors, then snap it up when panic set in. Once he owned it, he'd modernize the equipment just enough to make it profitable, fire half the workforce, and raise rates. By 1867, he controlled nearly every rail line entering New York City. If you wanted to ship grain from the Midwest to the eastern markets, you paid Vanderbilt's tolls. If you wanted to move manufactured goods from New York to the interior, you paid again. There was no alternative, no competition, just the Commodore's rates. Take them or leave them. And if you complained, he had a solution for that too. The Pennsylvania Railroad tried to challenge him in 1868. They announced plans to build a new line into New York, bypassing Vanderbilt's monopoly. It was a bold move. Pennsylvania Railroad was massive, one of the largest corporations in the world at the time. They had capital, political connections, engineering expertise. Vanderbilt's response was simple. He stopped all freight transfers between his lines and theirs. Overnight, goods piled up at rail junctions. Grain rotted in Pennsylvania's freight yards. Manufactured products sat immobile in warehouses. The Pennsylvania Railroad stock price collapsed. Investors panicked. Within 3 months, they came to Vanderbilt, not as competitors, but as supplicants, begging for a deal. He gave them one. They could access New York, at his rates, on his terms, with a percentage of every shipment going straight into his pocket. The Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the mightiest corporations in America, became a tributary feeding Vanderbilt's empire. The message was clear. You don't fight the Commodore, you pay him. But Vanderbilt's power wasn't just about money, it was about control over daily life. In the 1860s and 70s, railroads determined everything. Which towns got mail delivery? Which farms could get their crops to market before they spoiled? Which factories could receive raw materials on time? Vanderbilt played favorites ruthlessly. Towns that offered tax breaks got scheduled stops. Towns that resisted. Their stations saw fewer trains, longer delays, higher shipping rates. Some simply withered away, their populations draining toward more favored locations along his routes. Farmers in upstate New York found themselves trapped. They could sell their wheat locally for pennies or pay Vanderbilt's shipping rates to reach city markets, rates that often consumed half their profit margin. Some went under. Others sold their land and moved west, chasing the frontier railroads that Vanderbilt didn't yet control. Workers fared worse. Vanderbilt's rail lines were notorious for low wages and dangerous conditions. Brakemen lost fingers, sometimes hands, coupling freight cars manually. Engineers worked 18-hour shifts through blizzards and heat waves. Maintenance crews patched equipment with whatever was cheap and available, not what was safe. When workers complained, Vanderbilt fired them. When they tried to organize, he hired replacement crews within days. Labor was abundant. Jobs were scarce, and the Commodore knew exactly how to exploit that imbalance. A worker from the Hudson River Railroad wrote to a New York newspaper in 1871, "We are not men to Mr. Vanderbilt. We are parts, like the wheels and pistons. When we break, he replaces us." The letter was published anonymously. The worker was identified anyway. Someone in the newspaper's office sold the information. He was fired the next day. Politicians were easier to manage than workers. They could be bought. Vanderbilt's lobbyists haunted the halls of the New York State Legislature, handing out cash and stock certificates like party favors. Rail bills sailed through committees. Regulations vanished before they reached votes. When reform-minded legislators pushed back, Vanderbilt funded their opponents in the next election. He wasn't subtle about it. When a state senator publicly accused him of bribery in 1869, Vanderbilt sent him a telegram. "You have been bought and paid for like the others. The only difference is you forgot to stay bought." The senator lost his seat that November. But Vanderbilt's real genius wasn't buying politicians. It was making them dependent. He positioned his rail lines as economic engines. Towns along his routes prospered. Tax revenues flowed into state coffers. Jobs appeared, and anyone who threatened the Commodore's operations also threatened those jobs, those tax revenues, those prosperous towns. It was a perfect trap. Regulate Vanderbilt, and you hurt your own constituents. Fight him, and you fight economic growth itself. By the time legislators realized they'd ceded too much power, the rails were already too entrenched to dismantle. But empires, even rail empires, carry the seeds of their own destruction. Vanderbilt's monopoly worked because alternatives didn't exist. But by the mid-1870s, new rail lines were pushing west, financed by government land grants and rival industrialists. The Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific. Each one chipped away at the Commodore's dominance, offering shippers new routes and lower rates. More importantly, the public rage was building. Newspapers ran exposés on Vanderbilt's wealth, estimated at over $100 million by 1875, more than the federal government's annual budget. Political cartoons depicted him as a bloated octopus, tentacles wrapped around the nation's throat. Farmers organized into granges, demanding government regulation of rail rates. The Commodore dismissed it all. He'd faced public anger before. It never lasted. People needed rails more than they hated him. But this time was different. This time, the anger had teeth. In 1877, Vanderbilt died. He was 83. His empire passed to his son William, who lacked his father's ruthlessness and tactical genius. Within a decade, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 established federal oversight of railroads. Rate discrimination was banned. Monopolistic practices were outlawed. The age of the railroad barons was ending. Vanderbilt's empire survived, but it was never the same. The rails he'd forged into a weapon became public infrastructure. The chokehold loosened. America moved forward on those iron tracks, but no longer at the mercy of one man's will. The Commodore had won his empire, but in the end, the empire couldn't outlast the country itself.